When I saw my husband holding a small, unfamiliar key in his hand, my breath caught, not because of fear of discovery, but because I knew exactly what that key could open. He turned it over between his fingers, puzzled, his brow furrowed in thought. "What's this from?" he asked casually, but I could feel the weight of the question pressing against my chest. My mouth went dry as I reached for an answer that didn't exist. That tiny piece of metal, so light it barely seemed real, felt heavier than a confession. He looked at me again, this time longer, his gaze searching for something beneath my face, as though he could read the truth in the twitch of my lips or the way my hands tightened around the dish towel. I forced a smile that didn't quite land, my mind scrambling to create a believable lie. But then I saw it, the flicker of doubt in his eyes. The kind of doubt that doesn't shout, but whispers relentlessly. My heart began to pound, the sound deafening in the silence of our kitchen, and I realized this was it, the moment when everything I had been holding together with trembling hands would finally start to fall apart. The key wasn't just an object. It was a reminder. A reminder of a choice I made, a choice I can't undo, and a choice that has been unraveling the life I thought I had. Before I explain how that key ended up in his hand, before I tell you about the look on his face when the truth began to seep into the cracks of our marriage, let me take you back to the day my son left for college, the day an unexpected guest walked into our lives, and the moment I felt something awaken in me that I thought had been gone forever. But before I share this secret I've guarded so desperately, tell me, have you ever held on to something you shouldn't have, only to watch it destroy you piece by piece? The day my son left for college, the house felt like it sighed. Not a soft, relieved sigh, but a long, hollow one that seemed to echo against every wall. I stood by the doorway as we waved him off, his car heavy with boxes and books, his eyes shining with that restless excitement only youth can carry. He promised to call, and I promised to visit, and we both pretended the world wasn't shifting beneath our feet. When his car disappeared down the road, I turned back to the house, and for the first time in years, it felt too big. Too quiet. The silence settled like dust on everything, on the empty kitchen table, on the unused sofa, even on the hallway mirror where his reflection used to appear when he rushed out the door. I thought I had prepared myself for this moment, had rehearsed the idea of empty nest in my mind, but the reality was different. It wasn't just his absence I felt, it was the absence of energy, of noise, of the small chaos that had kept the house alive. My husband tried, in his way, to keep things normal. He buried himself in work, staying longer at the office, coming home with that distracted look that said his mind was still in spreadsheets and meetings. He asked me about bills, groceries, the car's maintenance schedule. But the warmth between us had been fading for years, and I had stopped asking for more, convincing myself I didn't need it. Our marriage wasn't unhappy, not in the dramatic sense. It was muted. Like a song played too quietly to make out the lyrics. Then one evening, not long after my son left, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find his best friend standing there, a bag slung over his shoulder, looking both hopeful and apologetic. He explained that his apartment plans had fallen through, and he wondered if he could stay just for a while. I hesitated for a heartbeat, not because I didn't want him there, but because I hadn't expected anyone to fill that empty space so soon. And then I smiled, told him of course, we had the room. I remember noticing the way his shoulders relaxed with relief, and how that made me feel oddly useful again. The first night he stayed, the house felt different. Lighter, almost. His presence brought back sounds I hadn't realized I missed, footsteps upstairs, the clink of a glass in the kitchen, laughter from a video playing too loud. I found myself making small changes without thinking, fresh flowers on the table, music playing softly in the background as I cooked. My husband welcomed him too, though his enthusiasm was practical. "It'll be good to have someone to help with the yard," he said, already thinking of tasks to assign. He didn't notice the shift in my mood, the way I seemed more alert, more awake. It wasn't immediate, what happened next. It wasn't some sudden spark or lightning bolt moment. It was quieter, slower. A glance that lingered longer than it should. A pause in conversation that felt charged. The kind of subtle tension that builds in corners and shadows, so gradual you can almost convince yourself it's not there. I told myself it was harmless. That it was natural to enjoy having company in the house again, someone young and bright who asked about books I liked, or laughed at my stories about my son when he was little. But deep down, beneath all the layers of rationalization, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Alive. I caught myself checking the clock before he came home, noticing the way I smoothed my hair without thinking, even humming as I set the table. These weren't things I had planned, and they weren't things I would ever admit out loud. Not then. Not even to myself. But looking back now, I can see it clearly, the moment the first crack appeared in the life I had built. It wasn't in a kiss, or a touch, or anything anyone would notice. It was in that breath I took when he walked through the door, the one that felt different. Fuller. Like the air had changed. And I didn't know it then, but that breath was the beginning of everything that followed. The mornings started to feel different. They weren't extraordinary by any means, coffee still brewed in the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator still filled the silence, but I began to notice tiny things that shouldn't have mattered. The sound of another set of footsteps upstairs, the way the hallway seemed less hollow when he moved through it, even the sight of his shoes by the door, next to my husband's. These small details pulled me out of the dull rhythm that had been my life for so long. It was on one of those mornings that he came back from the bakery down the street carrying fresh bread, still warm in the paper bag, and coffee from the cafe he liked. He handed one cup to me without fanfare, just a quiet "thought you might like this." My husband had never been the kind of man to do such things, not out of unkindness, but because his mind didn't think that way. He showed love through fixing leaky faucets and paying bills on time, not through gestures like this. I felt a flicker of something I didn't want to name as I took the cup, a flicker that had nothing to do with the coffee itself. We started talking more, and not just about surface things. He asked what music I used to listen to in college, and I found myself pulling out old records I hadn't touched in years. We talked about movies, about the books he was reading, about places I once wanted to see but never did. There was nothing wrong with these conversations. Anyone listening from the outside would have found them entirely innocent. But something about them felt like a thread being tugged loose from a tightly woven fabric, small at first, almost invisible, but powerful in what it could unravel. That evening, after dinner, we ended up in the living room while my husband finished up emails in his study. We watched a film, something light, forgettable, but I barely remember what it was about. What I remember is how close we sat on the sofa, closer than we should have. Not touching, but not quite distant either. The credits rolled, and we didn't move. There was a long silence. The kind that isn't awkward, but charged, like a held breath. I turned my head slightly, and he was looking at me. I should have stood up, should have broken that moment with some excuse about laundry or dishes. But I didn't. And then, without thinking, we kissed. It was quick, just a moment, a brush of lips that could almost be dismissed as a mistake. Almost. The second it happened, we both froze. I felt my breath catch, my heart lurch in my chest. He pulled back first, his face a mix of apology and shock. I stood abruptly, muttering something, I don't even remember what, and went to the kitchen under the pretense of tidying up. My hands shook as I put plates into the sink that were already clean. The rest of the evening passed in an odd blur. We avoided each other, moving around the house as if following some unspoken rule not to collide. My husband didn't notice anything, or if he did, he didn't say a word. He stayed buried in his work, the glow of his laptop casting him in blue light long past dinner. When I finally went to bed, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. My mind replayed that moment again and again, dissecting it, rewriting it, regretting it, but not entirely regretting it. I told myself it was nothing, that it had just happened in some strange moment of misplaced emotions, that it didn't have to mean anything. But lying there, I knew I was lying to myself. The next morning, things were awkward, but not in the way I expected. He acted as though nothing had happened, polite and careful, while I fumbled through making breakfast, aware of every small movement. The air between us felt different now, not heavy, exactly, but unstable, like something fragile that could shatter if handled wrong. I kept telling myself to stop thinking about it. I tried to lose myself in chores, in small routines, in conversations with my husband. But every time I walked past the sofa where it happened, my stomach tightened. Every time I caught his reflection in the window as he walked by outside, I remembered how close we had been, how easy it had been to cross that line. That night, my husband called from work to say he'd be late, caught up in something at the office. I felt relief wash over me before guilt even had time to form. Relief that I wouldn't have to look at him across the dinner table and wonder if he saw something in my face, some sign of what I'd done. Relief that I wouldn't have to force a conversation I didn't have the energy to have. I ate in near silence with our guest, the clinking of cutlery sounding too loud in the room. Our eyes met a few times, but neither of us said anything about the night before. Still, the silence between us said everything. It wasn't the kind of silence you could ignore. It was the kind that pressed on you, that lived in the corners of the room, that waited for you to slip and speak it aloud. When I went upstairs later, I looked back once and saw him sitting there, staring at his hands like he was thinking the same thing I was. That night I didn't sleep well. I kept shifting, the sheets feeling too warm, my own body restless. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that moment on the sofa, how it started, how it ended, and the way everything between us had changed in 1 second. And as much as I tried to tell myself that I could undo it, that it could just be a thing we forgot, I already knew, deep down, that there was no going back. I told myself that time would smooth over the awkwardness, that the memory of that kiss would fade into something harmless, like a moment of misplaced emotion quickly forgotten. But time didn't erase it, it sharpened it. Days passed, and instead of dimming, the memory took on edges, replaying in my mind at odd hours, folding laundry, washing dishes, even in the middle of a conversation with my husband. I tried to keep things normal. I buried myself in chores, filling my hands so my thoughts wouldn't wander. I scrubbed counters that didn't need scrubbing, rearranged shelves, and ironed clothes that could have gone untouched. But every time I glanced at the sofa, I felt that flicker in my chest again, that reminder that there was something now, unspoken, between us. One afternoon, I decided to escape the house for a while. The walls felt too close, too heavy with thoughts I didn't want to think. I drove into town, telling myself I needed groceries, but I parked in front of the old bookstore instead. The one with the dusty windows and the little bell on the door. I wandered through aisles of paper and stories, running my fingers along spines of books, trying to let the quiet drown out my thoughts. I picked up novels I hadn't touched in years, titles I remembered from when I was younger. I even bought a book I'd already read decades ago, not because I needed it, but because I thought we could talk about it later. That thought alone startled me, made me stop mid-step in the store. When had I started thinking that way? On my way home, my phone buzzed with a text from my husband, late tonight. Don't wait up, I stared at the message longer than I should have, feeling an odd mixture of relief and guilt knotting in my stomach. Relief that I wouldn't have to sit across from him at dinner and wonder if he could see something in my face. Relief that I wouldn't have to force conversation while every word felt like it was holding back something unsaid. But with that relief came the guilt, sharp and cold. That evening, it was just the two of us at the table. The clink of forks against plates sounded louder than usual, filling the silence neither of us seemed brave enough to break. He asked about the book I had bought earlier, and I answered, grateful for the distraction. The conversation slid easily into talk about other books, and then movies, and then the kind of aimless, late-night dreams you only share when you forget to guard your words. He told me about the places he wanted to visit, places my son had once talked about too, and asked if I had ever thought about going. I admitted I had, though I never made the plans. We talked about the coast, about mountains, about the feeling of starting somewhere fresh, and for a moment, I felt like I was somewhere else entirely. It wasn't just the topics. It was the way he listened, really listened, leaning in slightly, eyes steady, as though my words weren't just filling space but meant something. My husband had long stopped asking questions like that, not because he didn't care, but because we had both fallen into the ease of routine. Later that night, I walked into the kitchen to tidy up and caught sight of my own reflection in the darkened window, the small smile I didn't remember forming, the way my hand lingered on the book he had asked about. It startled me. That wasn't the face of someone who was just being polite to a guest. The next few days blurred into one another. We didn't talk about the kiss. It hung between us, invisible but undeniable. The way he paused before entering a room, the way I looked away too quickly, it was all part of it. I caught myself waiting for his footsteps in the hall, noticing the sound of the door when he came back from errands. I caught myself thinking about what he might say next, what we might talk about when the house was quiet again. There was a moment in the kitchen one afternoon that I'll never forget. I was reaching for a glass from the top shelf, standing on tiptoe, when he stepped forward and took it down for me. It was nothing, the kind of small thing anyone might do. But when he handed it to me, his fingers brushed mine, just lightly. It was the smallest touch, but it jolted through me. A rush of heat, a tightening in my throat. He didn't pull back quickly, and neither did I. That evening, my husband called again to say he'd be home late. I stood there holding the phone, staring at the darkened window above the sink. Part of me wanted to ask him to come home earlier, to fill the space, to restore some sense of normality. But I didn't. Instead, I turned off the light in the kitchen and stood for a long time in the dark, the silence pressing against me. I had told myself after that kiss that it was a moment we could forget, but now I saw it differently. We weren't forgetting it. We were living around it. And with every passing day, that single moment felt less like an accident and more like the beginning of something neither of us knew how to stop. The day we drove into the city together started off as nothing more than an errand. That was how I framed it in my mind, practical, harmless, necessary. The fridge was nearly empty, and I needed to stock up on more than the local corner shop could provide. He offered to come along before I even asked, tossing his jacket over his shoulder with an ease that felt almost careless. I hesitated for a moment, but I didn't say no. The drive itself was quiet at first, the radio humming softly, the hum of the tires against the road steady and low. I found myself glancing sideways more than once, studying his profile when I thought he wasn't looking. The way his hand rested on the edge of the seat, his focus on the road, the way he tapped his thumb absent-mindedly against the steering wheel when we stopped at lights, these were tiny details, but they stayed with me. We talked about small things, the kind of conversation that doesn't demand too much. About the bakery near the market, about the way the weather had shifted that week, about an old song that came on the radio that made us both laugh. But under that lightness, I could feel something heavier threading itself through. The longer we drove, the more I realized I wanted the road to stretch longer, to keep us in that car where time felt slowed down, away from the house, away from the weight of what we weren't saying. At the market, we wandered the aisles like any two people running errands, but even there, I felt the undercurrent. He reached for things on the higher shelves without being asked, passing them to me with a small smile. He made a joke about the price of fruit that made me laugh, the sound startling me with how unforced it felt. There was a moment, brief but impossible to ignore, when I reached for a jar and so did he. Our hands touched, lightly, and neither of us pulled away instantly. I told myself it was nothing, that people's hands brush all the time in crowded aisles, but my breath caught anyway. That simple touch lodged in my chest, and I carried it with me as we loaded the bags into the car. The drive home was slower, traffic thicker, the sky dimming into early evening. The sun dropped low, painting the road in amber, and in that shifting light, the car felt like its own little world. At one point, he adjusted the radio, his arm brushing mine. It wasn't a deliberate touch, but my body felt it all the same, a pulse of awareness I couldn't shake. When we finally pulled into the driveway, my husband's car wasn't there. I hadn't expected it to be, but seeing the empty space still sent a ripple of something through me, relief mixed with guilt, like two ingredients that could never quite blend. We carried the bags inside together, moving around each other in the kitchen. There was something almost domestic about it, one of us putting groceries away while the other unpacked. For a moment, I caught myself imagining how it would look to someone else, how easily it could be mistaken for something it wasn't. Or maybe, for something it almost was. Then, later that evening, the inevitable question came. My husband returned home, setting his keys on the counter, glancing at the bags I hadn't fully put away. "Where were you so long?" he asked, his voice casual but edged with curiosity. I answered too quickly. Too smoothly. Some explanation about traffic, about the line at the store, words I had lined up before he even asked. He didn't push, just nodded, and went upstairs to change. But I felt the lie stick in my throat like a thorn. After dinner, the house fell quiet again. My husband retreated to his study, the familiar sound of his typing filling the air. I walked into the living room, stopping by the window. Outside, the evening deepened, the street lamps flickering on one by one. Inside, the tension I had been ignoring all day settled over me like a blanket I couldn't shake off. I replayed the day in my head, the drive, the market, the touches that weren't really touches but felt like more. Each moment small on its own, but together they formed a chain, a pull I couldn't deny anymore. I stood there for a long time, staring out at the dim street, my reflection faint in the glass. I tried to tell myself that everything was still under control, that I hadn't crossed another line. But the truth was there, quiet and unrelenting. I didn't want to stop thinking about him. And the longer I stood there, the more I realized that what had started as something I could almost dismiss was slowly turning into something I couldn't ignore. Something that was pulling me further, one small moment at a time. The days after that trip felt different, as if the quiet of the house had grown heavier, almost aware of itself. My husband came and went the way he always did, his routine steady, predictable, comforting in one way and suffocating in another. He asked about groceries, about bills, about when the car would need servicing, his questions practical and simple. I answered them all just as I always had, but my thoughts were elsewhere. The small moments were starting to build into something I couldn't ignore. When he was in the room, I felt an almost constant awareness of him, like a low hum just beneath the surface of everything. Even when we weren't speaking, I felt it, the weight of glances, the way his presence seemed to fill every corner of the house. One evening, the sun was already sinking when I walked into the kitchen and found him there. The room was dim, the last light of day cutting across the counters, shadows stretching long. He was leaning against the counter, his posture relaxed, but his eyes were on me. That look stopped me where I stood. I moved past him to reach for something from the cabinet, and he stepped closer, not close enough to touch me, but close enough that I felt the space between us shrink. He didn't say anything, and neither did I. The air was thick with the silence, and I could feel my pulse in my throat. And then, without any words, we kissed. It wasn't clumsy or accidental this time. There was no startled pause, no fumbling retreat. It was brief, yes, but certain. It felt like a step taken, not a stumble. The moment broke almost as soon as it happened. I stepped back, my breath uneven, my hand instinctively gripping the edge of the counter to steady myself. He didn't move closer again. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, his expression unreadable, as though even he didn't know what he had just done. I turned away, pretending to check the oven though it was off, my thoughts racing faster than I could catch them. Every logical part of me screamed to shut it down, to draw a line, to act like it hadn't happened. But the part of me that had been silent for so long, the part of me that had been quietly waiting to feel alive again, refused to look away from the reality of it. When my husband came home that night, he noticed nothing. Or if he did, he didn't speak of it. He walked into the kitchen, kissed my cheek lightly, and asked if there was dinner. I answered as though nothing had changed, though inside I felt like everything had shifted. That night, I sat in bed long after the lights were off. My husband lay next to me, breathing slow and steady, already asleep. I watched the faint glow of the street lamp outside filter through the curtains and thought about what had happened in the kitchen. It wasn't the kiss itself that haunted me most, it was what it meant. The first one could have been written off as a mistake, an impulse. But this? This was deliberate. A choice. The next morning, I tried to keep things normal. I made coffee, watered the plants, tidied the living room. He walked into the kitchen, said good morning as though the night before hadn't happened, and I matched his tone. But underneath the surface, I felt the tremor. My husband left for work early that day. As the door closed behind him, the house shifted again. The air felt different, not lighter, not exactly heavier, but charged in a way I couldn't name. I went about my day, but I caught myself distracted. I burned toast. I stared too long out the kitchen window, watching the street for no reason. I folded laundry and refolded again. My body moved through the motions, but my mind stayed stuck in that moment, in that kiss, in the way it had felt like a door swinging open. By the afternoon, I realized something quietly terrifying. I hadn't once told myself that I regretted it. I told myself a lot of things to soften the truth. I told myself it didn't mean we would do anything more, that it didn't mean I was betraying my husband in every way. But beneath all that, there was the undeniable reality that I didn't want to forget how it felt. When evening came and my husband called to say he would be late, my reaction was instant. Relief. Sharp, unfiltered, almost shameful relief. Because I wouldn't have to sit across from him at dinner, pretending. I wouldn't have to answer questions with a steady voice. The house was quiet that night, too quiet. I wandered through it, turning on lamps just for the sake of having the rooms lit. I tried to read, but my eyes skimmed the pages without taking in the words. I sat at the kitchen table and thought about the weight of what had just happened, about the fact that a second kiss didn't feel like a line crossed but a line erased. I didn't know what would happen next. But for the first time, I realized I wasn't as afraid of that question as I should have been. The morning after that second kiss felt strangely hollow, as if the house itself sensed the change and didn't know how to respond. The ordinary routines, the smell of coffee brewing, the clatter of plates, the faint hum of the refrigerator, carried on, but they felt muted, like background noise in a place where everything important was happening silently. I moved through the kitchen with deliberate calm, careful not to look over my shoulder, careful not to let my hands shake as I sliced bread and poured coffee. He came in a few minutes later, quiet as always, but there was something in the air between us, a thickness that didn't need words to exist. We exchanged a few short comments about breakfast, the weather, something on the news. The words themselves didn't matter, it was the spaces between them that did. My husband left early that day. He had a meeting out of town, and the moment the front door closed behind him, the entire house shifted. The quiet was no longer just quiet, it was opportunity, and that realization frightened me even as it thrilled me. The day stretched out endlessly, the clock ticking louder than usual. I tried to fill the hours with tasks, sorting laundry, vacuuming, making lists for the week. But each task felt pointless, just movements to distract me from the weight pressing on my mind. I knew something had already started, whether I wanted to name it or not, and there was no way to undo the truth. That afternoon, he came into the kitchen, holding something small in his hand. Keys. At first, I didn't understand. He set them on the counter casually, as though they were nothing more than keys to a storage closet. "They're for my apartment," he said simply. His voice was calm, matter-of-fact, almost offhand, but my breath caught anyway. I stared at the keys. The small metal shapes seemed to glow under the kitchen light, heavier than they should have been. I didn't reach for them at first. Instead, I just looked, my mind scrambling for what to say, for what I should do. He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. The gesture alone was enough. I picked up the keys, my hand steadier than I expected, and felt their weight in my palm. It was a simple exchange, one that could have been framed as practical, but both of us knew it wasn't. That night, after dinner, my husband called from the road to say he'd be staying overnight. Something about an early meeting, about saving the drive back and forth. I answered casually, told him to be careful, wished him good night. But the moment I hung up, I stood in the kitchen holding the phone for a long time, staring at those keys on the counter. I didn't go anywhere that evening. I didn't even leave the house. But I didn't stop looking at them. Each time I passed through the kitchen, my eyes found them, my mind spinning. What unsettled me most wasn't fear. It wasn't shame. It was how calm I felt. I should have been panicking. I should have been consumed by guilt. Instead, there was only a steady, quiet awareness that a choice had been offered to me, and that I had already taken the first step by picking up those keys. I put them in my bag before bed. I told myself it was just to keep them safe, that I'd return them the next day, that I didn't want my husband to see them and ask questions. But when I slipped them into that pocket, I felt a shift deep inside me. The house was silent as I turned off the lights one by one. In the dark, I could hear my own breathing louder than usual. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, the weight of the keys almost a physical thing beside my bed. I thought about what they represented, about the door they could open, about the part of me that had been dormant for years, a part that had woken up the moment I wrapped my fingers around that cold metal. When I finally drifted into restless sleep, it wasn't dreams of guilt or panic that came. It was something stranger. The awareness that a line had already been crossed long before any door was opened. The keys were only the proof. The next morning I woke with the uneasy feeling that the world was holding its breath. My husband was still away, and the house felt strangely weightless without him. The quiet should have been comforting, but it wasn't. It pressed against my skin like static. I moved through the motions of the day, made coffee, washed dishes, tidied the kitchen, but my thoughts kept circling back to the keys lying in the side pocket of my bag. Every time I glanced at the bag, a low thrum of awareness pulsed through me. I tried to distract myself, walking from room to room, pretending to notice things that needed cleaning, drawers that needed organizing. But none of it held my focus for long. The thought of those keys was louder than anything else. By mid-morning, I stopped pretending. I stood in the kitchen, one hand on the strap of the bag, the other gripping the counter for balance. It was absurd, how heavy such a small decision felt, but I already knew what I was going to do. I told myself it was just curiosity. That I only wanted to see the apartment, nothing more. A practical visit. That lie sounded flimsy even in my own head, but I clung to it anyway, because it was easier than admitting the truth, that I had already decided, days ago, weeks ago maybe, in ways I didn't want to look too closely at. I slipped the keys into my coat pocket and left. The drive felt longer than it probably was. My hands tightened on the steering wheel at every stoplight. I rehearsed excuses in my mind, excuses for myself, for anyone who might ask, for no one in particular. By the time I reached the building, my chest was tight, my pulse hammering. The apartment was small, tucked away on a quiet street. There was nothing remarkable about it, a narrow hallway, a modest living room, walls painted the color of dusted cream. But the moment I opened the door, everything inside me shifted. It wasn't about the apartment. It was about what it meant to step over that threshold. He was there, waiting. He didn't say much when I walked in. Neither did I. We didn't need to. The silence between us said more than words could. I set my bag down on the small table by the door. The keys made a dull, final sound when I dropped them there, as if they were marking the point of no return. We didn't have a long conversation. There was no speech, no declaration, nothing rehearsed. Whatever needed to be understood had already been spoken in glances, in pauses, in all the moments that had led to this one. The hours after that are difficult to explain, not because I want to hide them, but because there are no neat, clean words for what happened. It wasn't a single decision but the culmination of dozens of smaller ones, stacked so quietly that by the time I realized I had crossed the line, I was already far past it. We spent the night together. The sentence is small, almost too small for the weight of what it holds, but it's the truth. By morning, the apartment felt different. The night had emptied the air of its tension, leaving a stillness that wasn't peace, not exactly, but something like it. Sunlight filtered through the blinds in thin stripes, catching on the edges of furniture, turning ordinary things into harsh reminders. I sat on the edge of the sofa, my coat draped over my lap, staring at the faint scuff marks on the floor where someone had moved a chair too many times. My mind felt blank and loud at once, like someone had scraped out the words but left the echoes behind. He stood in the kitchen, quiet. Neither of us said much. What was there to say? When I finally left, the sky had turned overcast. I drove home slowly, as though the weight of the car itself was dragging behind me. The house greeted me the way it always did, with the same creak of the front door, the same scent of coffee lingering faintly in the air, the same framed photos on the walls. Everything looked exactly the same, and yet nothing felt the same. I stood in the hallway for a long time, staring at my own reflection in the small mirror by the door. My face didn't look different, but I felt like I was seeing a stranger anyway. The keys were still in my coat pocket. I pulled them out and turned them over in my palm, the metal cold and unyielding. I should have put them away, should have hidden them, should have done something to erase the sight of them from the world. But I didn't. I left them in my bag again, almost without thinking, and climbed the stairs slowly, as though every step was a question I couldn't answer. That night, when I finally closed my eyes, I didn't dream. The emptiness inside my head was almost a relief. But beneath that quiet, I knew something had shifted permanently. There was no pretending, no undoing. The line had been crossed, and I couldn't go back. The day after I came back from the apartment felt like a strange performance. Every movement, every word I spoke to my husband, felt rehearsed, even though I hadn't practiced anything. I tried to act normal, tried to pretend the night before hadn't happened, but I could feel the stiffness in my own voice, hear the slight delay before every answer I gave. My husband returned from his trip that evening. He came in carrying the faint smell of the road, a jacket slung over one shoulder, his voice tired but calm. He asked how things were while he was away, and I told him about groceries, about a neighbor stopping by, about small things that filled the silence between us. But there was another silence too, the one inside me. The one I was desperate for him not to hear. After dinner, I excused myself to clean up the kitchen, grateful for the escape. I stood at the sink, hands in soapy water, watching the bubbles break apart under the running tap. It was a simple chore, something I had done thousands of times, but that night it felt like an anchor, like if I focused hard enough on the plates and cups, I could steady myself. But the keys were still in my bag. I hadn't put them back in their original place. I hadn't hidden them well enough either. They were in the side pocket, where I always kept receipts and small things I didn't think about. Every time I thought about them, my chest tightened. I told myself I would return them soon. I told myself I would find a way to undo at least that part of this. But I didn't move them. The next morning, I felt restless. I couldn't settle into any one thing. I started laundry and abandoned it halfway through folding. I made a grocery list and left it blank after 3 items. I kept checking my phone, though I didn't expect a call. At one point, I reached for my bag to get my keys for the house, and my fingers brushed against the cold metal of the other ones. My breath caught. Even touching them made my heart beat faster, a mix of panic and something else, something I didn't want to name. That afternoon, my husband came into the kitchen, his work phone pressed to his ear, his briefcase dangling from one hand. He was distracted, but his eyes drifted to my bag on the chair. "Is that mine?" he asked casually, noticing the color. I froze for a second before shaking my head too quickly. "No, it's mine." He nodded, not thinking twice, and returned to his call. But the exchange left my nerves raw. It reminded me that the smallest slip could unravel everything. The day dragged into evening, and the evening dragged into night. I found myself wandering through the house, turning off lamps one by one, the light shrinking behind me as I moved. The quiet should have been calming, but it wasn't. Later, when the house was still, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my bag. I thought about taking the keys out, about putting them somewhere safe, somewhere hidden. But I didn't. Instead, I left them there, exactly where they were, telling myself I would deal with them tomorrow. The next morning, I woke to sunlight spilling through the curtains. The air felt heavy in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. I reached for my bag, intending to finally move the keys, but I stopped when I saw my husband standing by the door, searching for his own set. He glanced over at me, his expression casual. "Have you seen my spare?" he asked, holding up one keyring and patting his pockets. I shook my head, my throat dry. "Not recently." He accepted the answer easily enough, returning to his search, but the moment left me shaken. Because for the first time, I truly understood how fragile it all was. One wrong moment, one wrong glance, and everything I had been pretending to keep together could shatter. And yet, even with that fear pressing down on me, I didn't move the keys. I couldn't. They stayed right where they were, silent, cold, waiting. It happened on an ordinary morning, the kind that felt almost painfully routine. The kind where you think nothing can happen because everything feels too familiar. My husband was standing by the kitchen counter, rummaging through a drawer that always stuck, the one we had meant to fix for years. I was at the sink, rinsing a cup, when I heard the faint jingle of metal, a sound so small, but so sharp it cut straight through the air. He held something up. At first, I couldn't see what it was. Then the light hit, and I saw the keys. Not his keys. Not my house keys. The keys. They lay in his palm, glinting, ordinary and damning all at once. "What are these?" he asked casually, but there was an undercurrent to his voice I couldn't name. The words I had rehearsed in my mind for weeks, excuses, explanations, deflections, all vanished. My throat felt dry, my mind blank. I forced out something vague, something about old locks, about not remembering, but my own voice betrayed me. It sounded too thin, too quick, and his eyes lingered on me for a moment longer than usual. He didn't press. He didn't accuse. He simply set them on the counter and moved on, like it was nothing. But the damage had already been done. For the rest of the morning, I couldn't stop looking at those keys. Every time I passed the counter, I felt my chest tighten. Every time I heard them shift slightly against the wood, my heart seemed to skip. I tried to distract myself with chores, folding laundry that didn't need folding, wiping counters that were already clean. But my mind kept looping back to that single moment, to the way he had looked at me, to the silence that had followed. Later that afternoon, he left for work, and the house felt heavier than it had in days. I picked up the keys, turning them over in my hand, as if their weight could somehow explain what to do next. I thought about hiding them somewhere else, throwing them in a drawer, even tossing them out entirely, but I didn't. I set them back down, almost defiantly, as though moving them would somehow confirm the guilt I hadn't spoken. That evening, he came home early. Earlier than expected. He didn't mention the keys. He didn't even glance toward the counter. But I felt his silence more than I would have felt words. I went upstairs, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the wall. My thoughts weren't just racing, they were colliding, fragments of moments and fears and memories all crashing together. I remembered the apartment. The door closing behind me. The way the air had felt there, thick with the kind of tension that comes before something irreversible. And now, I thought about my husband, about the way he had held those keys without knowing what they truly meant. Or maybe he did know. Maybe that was worse. That night, the phone rang. It was my son. He spoke with the same enthusiasm he always had, his voice light, casual, happy. But then, he said the words I wasn't ready to hear, "I'm coming home for the weekend." The announcement hung in the air like an echo that wouldn't fade. I murmured something back, some excited agreement, but inside, I felt the ground shift. The house that had been heavy with secrets was about to fill with his presence, his voice, his eyes that might see more than I wanted them to. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to my husband's steady breathing beside me. The keys were still downstairs on the counter, quiet but louder than anything else in the house. I couldn't stop thinking about them. About the way his hand had looked holding them. About the way his eyes had paused on mine. About how close it all suddenly felt to breaking apart. The weekend came faster than I expected. My son's voice over the phone had sounded so bright, so certain, and now that brightness was spilling into the house again. The morning of his arrival, I stood in the kitchen, hands busy with chopping vegetables I didn't even plan to cook, just to keep them moving. My husband moved through the rooms with an energy I hadn't seen in a while. He was tidying up, straightening things, picking up the smallest bits of clutter. He didn't say much, but I noticed the way he seemed more present, his eyes sharper. Whether that was because of the keys or just the anticipation of our son coming home, I didn't know. Maybe it was both. The keys were no longer on the counter. He had moved them. Not back to me, not back into the drawer where spare keys usually went, just somewhere else. I hadn't seen where, and I didn't ask. That small change sat in my chest like a stone. By the time my son's car pulled into the driveway, my heart was already pounding. I stood by the window for a moment, watching him step out, his bag slung over his shoulder, the same restless energy he'd had since he was a teenager still flickering around him. When he walked through the door, the house felt instantly louder. He hugged me, warm and easy, and for a moment I let myself breathe him in, the familiar scent of his shampoo, the faint trace of city air on his jacket. Behind him, my husband smiled. And just over his shoulder, for the briefest second, I caught sight of the other one. The guest. He stepped forward to greet my son, and for a moment I saw him not as the quiet presence who had filled the empty spaces in my days, not as the one who handed me keys, but as my son's friend. The lines blurred and twisted inside me, and I felt my stomach knot. The house was crowded with voices now, my son's laughter, my husband's questions, the scrape of chairs against the floor. On the surface, it looked like any other reunion, warm and ordinary. But beneath that, the tension ran like a second current. Every glance felt heavy. Every silence felt louder. I watched my husband sometimes, the way his eyes would linger on me for just a moment longer than they used to. He didn't say anything, not about the keys, not about the way things felt different, but there was something in his quiet that unnerved me more than words ever could. My son was oblivious, at least as far as I could tell. He told stories about his classes, about his friends, about late nights in the dorms and professors who talked too much. I nodded, I laughed, I said all the things a mother should say. But even as I smiled, I felt my throat tighten every time his friend's voice entered the conversation. That night, after dinner, the house began to settle again. My son went upstairs to unpack. My husband stayed behind in the kitchen, rinsing dishes. I stood in the doorway for a long time, watching him, wondering if he would look up, if he would ask, if he would say anything. He didn't. He dried his hands on a towel, set it down neatly, and walked past me without a word. I stayed there long after he left the room, staring at the sink, my reflection faint in the darkened window above it. The house felt different now, not just because my son was home, not just because there were more voices in the rooms, but because something had shifted that couldn't be undone. I thought about the keys. About where he might have put them. About whether he'd kept them at all. I thought about the apartment. About that night. And I thought about myself, about the woman I had been before, about the woman I had become, and about how those two versions of me no longer fit neatly together. Later, when the house was quiet again, I sat alone at the kitchen table. The light above me cast a small circle, leaving the rest of the room in shadow. I stared at my hands, at the faint crease in my palm where the keys had rested once, and I realized something that chilled me. The truth wasn't just about being caught. The truth was about living with myself every single day, knowing exactly what I had done, and knowing that no matter how carefully I tried to cover it, nothing would ever feel the same again. That night, I didn't sleep. Because some endings aren't loud. They don't come with shouting or breaking. They come quietly, with a silence so heavy you can barely breathe under it. And this was my silence now.